What happens when you see too much? Have you ever noticed that the most intelligent, perceptive people you know often seem less content than those with simpler minds? Why do those with the greatest capacity for awareness frequently struggle with profound melancholy and isolation that others never experience? Tonight, we'll explore one of Carl Jung's most haunting insights, what I call the curse of consciousness, the paradoxical relationship between heightened awareness and human suffering. This builds directly on our previous explorations of the shadow and projection, but takes us to an even deeper level of understanding about the human condition. What you'll discover might explain struggles you've felt throughout your life, especially if you've ever been told you think too much or feel too deeply. And by the end, I'll reveal Jung's radical solution to this curse, a path that might transform your relationship with your own consciousness in ways you never imagined possible. The painful gift of seeing. What happens when you see too much? When your awareness extends beyond what others perceive? When you notice patterns, meanings, and contradictions that slip past most people undetected? Jung observed a troubling pattern in his clinical practice. Those with the highest intelligence and most acute perceptual abilities often suffered the most psychologically. While others move through life with relative ease, these individuals experience profound alienation, existential anxiety, and a peculiar form of suffering that seemed directly connected to their heightened awareness. Think about the perceptive child who notices the subtle tensions in their family that everyone else denies, or the sensitive employee who feels the undercurrents in office politics that colleagues ignore, or the philosophical thinker who perceives the contradictions in our social systems that most accept without question. This heightened perception becomes a double-edged sword, a gift that wounds its bearer. As Jung wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, there are as many nights as days, and the one is just as long as the other in the year's course. Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness, and the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. Consider figures like Vincent van Gogh, whose extraordinary perceptual abilities allowed him to see the world with unprecedented vividness, yet who struggled with debilitating psychological pain. Or think of brilliant minds like Alan Turing or Sylvia Plath, whose exceptional insights were paired with profound suffering. Even fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes exemplify this pattern. Extraordinary perceptual abilities coupled with melancholy, addiction, and isolation. This connection between high intelligence and psychological suffering isn't just anecdotal. Contemporary research confirms what Jung observed clinically. Higher IQ correlates with increased rates of certain psychological disorders, particularly those involving rumination and existential anxiety. One study found that members of Mensa, those with IQs in the top 2%, reported significantly higher rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and ADHD than the general population. But why? What creates this curse of consciousness that turns the gift of awareness into a burden? Jung identified several mechanisms that explain this paradoxical relationship. In our next section, we'll explore the first and perhaps most fundamental of these mechanisms: how awareness creates separation. But before we continue, I invite you to reflect. Have you ever felt that your own perceptiveness or intelligence has sometimes been more of a burden than a blessing? Have there been moments when you wished you could see less clearly, feel less deeply, or think less intensely? The first wound, awareness, creates separation. Jung understood that heightened consciousness creates separation from others, from nature, and even from parts of ourselves. The more aware you become, the more you differentiate from the unconscious unity that less reflective people take for granted. Think about it this way. A person with limited self-awareness moves through life embedded in their experience, rarely stepping outside of it to observe or question. There's a simplicity and immediacy to this way of being, a direct participation in life without the complications of excessive reflection. But the highly conscious individual stands apart, always observing, analyzing, and questioning, not just their surroundings, but themselves. They develop what psychologists now call meta-awareness, the capacity to observe their own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors as objects of attention. This creates a peculiar kind of psychological distance, almost as if the highly conscious person is always partially outside of their own experience, watching themselves live rather than simply living. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre captured this condition perfectly when he described consciousness as a being which is what it is not and is not what it is, always separated from itself by the very act of self-awareness. Consider how this plays out socially. When you perceive the unspoken dynamics, unconscious motivations, and hidden contradictions in social situations that others don't notice, you can't participate with the same unquestioning immersion. You become like the audience watching actors on stage while everyone else believes the play is reality. A client once described this experience to me perfectly. At parties, I feel like I'm watching a nature documentary, while everyone else is just being animals in the wild. They're having fun because they don't see what I see. They don't notice the status games, the insecurities behind the laughter, the subtle rejections and alliances forming. I can't unsee it, and it makes me feel like I'm behind glass, watching but never fully participating. This separation extends beyond social interactions. The highly intelligent person often finds themselves alienated from cultural narratives and social institutions that others accept without question. They see the inconsistencies in religious doctrines, the hypocrisies in political ideologies, and the unexamined assumptions in social norms. While this critical perspective can be valuable, it also undermines the sense of belonging and meaning that these shared narratives provide for others. Jung observed that this alienation is the first wound caused by heightened consciousness, the painful separation from the comforting immersion in collective unconsciousness that less reflective individuals enjoy. But in our next section, we'll explore an even deeper aspect of the curse: how awareness multiplies suffering through the burden of possibility and choice. Before we continue, though, consider this question. When have you felt most separated from others because you perceived something they didn't? How did this awareness affect your sense of connection and belonging? The second wound, the burden of possibility. The greater the consciousness, the greater the freedom. The greater the freedom, the greater the responsibility. These words capture Jung's insight into the second aspect of the curse of consciousness, the burden of possibility and choice. The person of limited awareness experiences life somewhat like a train on tracks, following predetermined patterns with a sense of inevitability and thus, paradoxically, a kind of security. There's comfort in believing there's only one way forward, only one interpretation of events, only one possible response to circumstances. But heightened consciousness reveals multiple perspectives, countless interpretations, and endless possibilities for action. While this expanded awareness theoretically creates greater freedom, it also generates a peculiar form of suffering, the anxiety of choice and the weight of responsibility for those choices. Think about seemingly simple decisions. The less reflective person chooses a career path based on family tradition, cultural expectations, or simple pragmatism, feeling little conflict about the roads not taken. But the highly conscious individual perceives all the branching possibilities, considers the existential meaning of each option, imagines the different selves they might become through different choices, and often experiences paralyzing indecision or lingering regret, regardless of what they eventually choose. This is what the existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that comes with perceiving too many possibilities and bearing full responsibility for choosing among them. In the concept of anxiety, he wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, which emerges when the spirit wants to posit the synthesis, and freedom looks down into its own possibility." We see this burden illustrated powerfully in Shakespeare's Hamlet, a character whose extraordinary intelligence and awareness creates paralysis rather than decisive action. His famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be," perfectly captures the existential dilemma of the overly conscious mind drowning in possibilities. Jung recognized that this burden extends beyond practical decisions to interpretations of meaning. The psychologically naive person experiences events with a kind of literal simplicity. Things happen because they happen. Meanings are fixed and straightforward. But the highly conscious individual perceives layers of symbolic significance, multiple causal explanations, and vast interpretive possibilities in every experience. This multiplicity of meaning can be destabilizing. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." The highly intelligent person often finds themselves suspended in this oscillation, unable to rest in a single interpretation or meaning framework. A brilliant client once told me, "I envy people who can just say everything happens for a reason and actually believe it. I see a dozen possible reasons for everything, contradictory patterns fighting for prominence, cosmic significance and random chance both equally plausible. It's exhausting to hold all these possibilities in mind at once, but I can't seem to stop. In our next section, we'll explore the third and perhaps most painful aspect of the curse of consciousness: how awareness illuminates the shadow sides of existence that others can comfortably ignore. But first, I invite you to reflect. How has your own awareness of multiple possibilities affected your decision-making and peace of mind? When has seeing too many options or interpretations created suffering rather than freedom? The third wound: unavoidable confrontation with shadow. Perhaps the most painful aspect of heightened consciousness is what Jung called the unavoidable confrontation with the shadow. Not just the personal shadow we explored in our first discussion, but the collective shadow of humanity and existence itself. While the average person can maintain comforting illusions about human nature, social structures, and existential realities, the highly conscious individual cannot avoid seeing the darkness that others manage to ignore or deny. This clarity about the shadow side of existence creates a particular kind of suffering that the less aware are spared. Consider how this manifests in relation to human nature. Those with average awareness can maintain relatively simple, optimistic views about people, including themselves. They can genuinely believe in uncomplicated goodness, straightforward motivations, and clear moral boundaries. But the highly conscious person perceives the complex contradictions in every human heart, the selfishness behind apparent altruism, the destructive impulses alongside creative ones, the capacity for cruelty within even the kindest souls. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion, unfortunately, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The highly intelligent person cannot avoid seeing this shadow in themselves, in those they love, and in humanity broadly. This awareness makes simple moral judgments impossible and undermines the comforting belief in human goodness that sustains many people through difficult times. This confrontation extends to social and institutional realities as well. While others can believe wholeheartedly in the justness of social systems, the benevolence of institutions, or the wisdom of leadership, the perceptive individual sees the shadow aspects of every social structure, the hidden power dynamics, the systemic contradictions, the gap between stated values and actual operations. Think of whistleblowers who recognize institutional corruption that colleagues overlook, or social critics who identify systemic injustices that beneficiaries of those systems never perceive. Their clarity of vision often leads to isolation, as giving voice to these shadow realities typically results in rejection rather than gratitude. Finally, and perhaps most painfully, heightened consciousness forces confrontation with existential shadows, the realities of mortality, meaninglessness, and cosmic indifference that less reflective people can avoid through immersion in daily concerns or unquestioned religious narratives. The highly intelligent person often cannot take comfort in simplistic answers to existential questions. They see the contradictions in religious doctrines, the limitations of philosophical systems, and the fundamental uncertainty underlying all human knowledge about ultimate matters. This awareness creates what existentialists call cosmic anxiety, a profound unease about the human condition that no achievement or relationship can fully resolve. In literature, Dostoevsky's character, Ivan Karamazov, perfectly exemplifies this aspect of the curse. His intelligence forces him to confront the problem of suffering with a clarity that makes the faith-based consolations acceptable to others entirely inadequate for him. But here we approach the threshold of Jung's most profound insight, the unexpected path beyond this curse of consciousness. In our next section, we'll explore his radical solution, which doesn't involve retreat from awareness, but a counterintuitive journey deeper into it. Before we continue, though, reflect on this. What shadow realities has your own consciousness forced you to confront that others seem able to ignore? How has this clarity affected your sense of meaning and place in the world? The unexpected path. Through, not back. If heightened consciousness causes such suffering, wouldn't the solution be to think less, perceive less, question less? To return to the unreflective simplicity that less intelligent people seem to enjoy? Jung's answer is a resounding no. The path forward, he insists, lies not in retreat from consciousness, but in advancing through it to something beyond, what he called transcendent consciousness. This isn't about knowing less, but about knowing differently, moving from the fragmented, analytical awareness of the conventional intellect to an integrated, direct perception that transcends ordinary categories of understanding. This is the great revelation of Jung's approach to the curse of consciousness. The only way out is through. Going backward is impossible once certain thresholds of awareness have been crossed. As he wrote in The Undiscovered Self, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. But what exactly does this transcendent consciousness look like? How does it differ from the analytical awareness that creates suffering? First, transcendent consciousness reintegrates what conventional intelligence separates. Where the analytical mind divides experience into subject and object, self and other, good and evil, transcendent awareness perceives the underlying unity without erasing the distinct qualities of each part. This is not a regression to pre-conscious unity, but an advancement to post-conscious integration. Think of how a master musician moves beyond technical analysis of a composition to direct embodiment of the music, or how a martial arts master transcends conscious thought about technique to enter a state of flow where distinctions between self and action dissolve. This isn't less awareness. It's a higher form of awareness that reconciles opposites instead of being trapped between them. Second, transcendent consciousness embraces paradox rather than trying to resolve it. The suffering of ordinary intelligence often comes from trying to force reality into non-contradictory logical frameworks. Transcendent awareness accepts that reality itself is paradoxical, that opposites can coexist, that multiple contradictory perspectives can be simultaneously valid, that some truths can only be expressed through apparent contradiction. This capacity to hold paradox creates a peculiar kind of peace unavailable to the ordinary intellect. As Jung wrote in Psychological Types, the greater the contrast, the greater the potential. Great energy only comes from a correspondingly great tension between opposites. Finally, transcendent consciousness shifts from knowing about to knowing through participation. Ordinary intelligence maintains separation between knower and known, creating the alienation we discussed earlier. Transcendent awareness involves direct participation in what is known, a way of knowing through being, rather than through detached observation. Consider the difference between studying love intellectually and experiencing love directly, or between analyzing a painting technically and being moved by its beauty. Transcendent consciousness prioritizes this direct, participatory knowledge while still maintaining the capacity for reflection. This vision of transcendent consciousness appears across wisdom traditions worldwide. We find it in Buddhism's concept of prajna, wisdom beyond conceptual knowledge, in Taoism's notion of wei wu wei, action through non-action, in the Christian mystical tradition's ideas of unknowing, and in the Hindu concept of jnana, direct knowledge of ultimate reality. Jung saw this transcendent consciousness as the birthright of every human being, not just an elite few, but the path to it often requires passing through the suffering of ordinary consciousness first. Those blessed or cursed with high intelligence face this suffering more acutely, but may also have greater capacity to move beyond it, toward transcendence. In our final section, we'll explore practical paths toward this transcendent consciousness, how to move from the curse of awareness to its ultimate blessing. But first, consider this question. Have you experienced moments when your knowing shifted from analytical separation to direct participation? What was different about your consciousness in those moments? Practical paths beyond the curse. How do we move from the suffering of heightened consciousness toward the integration of transcendent awareness? Jung identified several pathways, each addressing a different aspect of the curse we've explored. First, to heal the wound of separation, Jung emphasized what he called active imagination, a practice of engaging directly with unconscious material through creative dialogue. Unlike passive fantasy or intellectual analysis, active imagination involves conscious participation with the autonomous elements of the psyche. Try this. Select a problem or question that your intellectual mind has analyzed without resolution. Put aside analytical thinking and allow an image to form that represents this issue. Then engage this image in dialogue, allowing it to speak with its own voice rather than directing it with your conscious mind. Record this dialogue through writing, art, or movement. What emerges often transcends the limitations of ordinary consciousness, offering perspectives and solutions unavailable to conventional intelligence alone. This practice bridges the gap between conscious and unconscious, healing the painful separation that comes with heightened awareness. Second, to address the burden of possibility, Jung advocated for what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing possibilities together until a third, unexpected alternative emerges. This isn't compromise or choosing one option over another, but allowing contradictory possibilities to create something entirely new. Practice this by identifying a dilemma where multiple options or interpretations have created paralyzing awareness. Instead of trying to choose between alternatives, consciously hold all possibilities in mind simultaneously without premature resolution. Pay attention to dreams, synchronicities, and intuitive insights that might point toward unexpected integrations of these apparent opposites. Leonardo da Vinci exemplified this approach, writing in his notebooks about the value of contemplating contradictory perspectives. Iron rusts from disuse. Water loses its purity from stagnation. Even so, does inaction sap the vigor of the mind. Yet this contemplation wasn't merely intellectual. It fueled creative synthesis beyond ordinary categories. Third, to transform the confrontation with shadow, Jung prescribed what contemporary psychologists might call radical acceptance, not merely acknowledging darkness intellectually, but fully experiencing and integrating it without denial or rationalization. Begin this practice by identifying an aspect of shadow, personal, collective, or existential, that your awareness has forced you to confront. Rather than trying to resolve it intellectually or turn away from it, approach it with complete attention and acceptance. What happens when you fully experience this shadow reality without trying to change, explain, or escape it? Many discover what Jung described as the gold in the shadow. Unexpected resources, insights, and even joy hidden within what initially appears as darkness. This alchemical transformation doesn't eliminate shadow, but reveals its essential role in the wholeness of existence. For all these approaches, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of symbols, images that point beyond themselves to realities that cannot be fully articulated in conceptual language. Where ordinary intelligence relies on concepts and propositions, transcendent consciousness works through symbols that unite rather than divide aspects of experience. Engage with symbols that resonate deeply with you through art, ritual, dreams, or contemplation. Unlike intellectual concepts that you analyze from a distance, allow yourself to participate in these symbols, to be moved and transformed by them rather than merely understanding them. Jung himself practiced what he prescribed. Despite his extraordinary intelligence, he balanced intellectual work with manual labor, building stone structures at his retreat in Bollingen. He engaged directly with dreams and visions rather than merely analyzing them. He created mandalas, symbolic representations of wholeness, as a personal practice of integration. The result wasn't diminished awareness, but transformed awareness, consciousness that illuminated without burning, that perceived shadow without being overcome by it, that recognized multiplicity without paralysis. This is the promise of Jung's approach to the curse of consciousness. Not retreat, but transformation. Not less knowing, but deeper knowing. The final revelation. From curse to blessing. We began by exploring the curse of consciousness, how heightened awareness creates suffering through separation, multiplicity, and confrontation with shadow. We've traced Jung's unexpected solution, moving through, rather than away from consciousness, toward a transcendent awareness that integrates what ordinary intelligence divides. This brings us to the final revelation. What appears as a curse from one perspective becomes a blessing from another. The very qualities that create suffering at one level of consciousness become sources of extraordinary fulfillment at another. The separation that creates alienation becomes, in transcendent awareness, the capacity for genuine love, a connection that honors difference rather than erasing it. The multiplicity that creates anxiety becomes the foundation for creativity, bringing together elements that have never before been combined. The shadow confrontation that creates despair becomes the source of authentic compassion. Engagement with suffering that neither denies darkness nor is overcome by it. This transformation doesn't happen automatically or easily. It requires the courage to face what most avoid, the persistence to engage what seems impossible to resolve, and the faith to follow a path whose destination cannot be clearly seen in advance. But for those willing to undertake this journey, the reward is profound. Not happiness in the conventional sense, but something deeper and more enduring. A sense of participation in the wholeness of existence, with all its light and shadow that gives meaning to both joy and suffering. As Jung wrote in one of his final works, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "The meaning of my existence is that life has addressed a question to me, or conversely, I myself am a question which is addressed to the world, and I must communicate my answer, for otherwise I am dependent upon the world's answer." This is the ultimate liberation from the curse of consciousness, not answering the questions of existence definitively, but becoming a living response to them, embodying rather than merely understanding the paradoxes of being human. So, if you have felt the burden of seeing too much, thinking too deeply, or feeling too intensely, if your intelligence has sometimes seemed more curse than blessing, know that you may be experiencing not a mistake to be corrected, but an invitation to be answered. The path forward isn't knowing less, but knowing differently, not dimming your awareness, but transforming it, not escaping consciousness, but fulfilling its deeper purpose. For in Jung's vision, consciousness itself has a teleology, a direction and purpose beyond our individual aims. And those who suffer its curse most acutely may be closest to discovering its ultimate blessing. What would it mean for you to accept this invitation, to move not away from your awareness, but through it to something beyond? What might become possible if you approached your intelligence not as a burden to manage, but as a seed of something greater waiting to emerge? Remember, The path through the curse of consciousness isn't about knowing less. It's about knowing all the way through to wisdom. Not seeing less clearly, but seeing with eyes that perceive both the parts and the whole, both the shadow and the light, in a single, integrated vision. What would your life look like if you embraced this journey?